just check my presentation. I've got about 30 slides to go, so they're fairly dense, but there's less of them than we've been through so far, and a fair bit of time for a conversation, which would be really quite good to have. So let's don't worry about being unable to interact and talk. We'll get a fair bit of chance to do that. So I've covered Minsky's model, and what I'll do now is talk about how I tried to turn it into a mathematical model. And one thing which has come out of that is that I'm now getting interest from, finally getting interest from conventional economic institutions, including the New Zealand Treasury, I'm delighted to say, about the possibility of including this sort of model in their repertoire as well as the neoclassical models, which I think is essential. So what you need to model the vision that Minsky had is a cyclical model. You can't start with an equilibrium one and add shocks to it. You've got to start the model as inherently cyclical. And my favourite model on that front was built by a guy called Richard Goodwin back in 1967. Richard was probably one of the pioneers, or the pioneer, of chaos and complexity theory in economics. But not the world's best writer. He was a great artist, great painter, great mathematician, not the world's best writer. The guy wrote and explained it very well, this guy called John Blatt, Austrian-born Australian pure mathematician, who twice was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physics, wrote a very good book called Dynamic Economic Systems. So if anyone wants to get a good handle on how to model and how to see economic history from a dynamic perspective, the history of economic thought that way, get John's book out of the library. It's out of print, but Dynamic Economic Systems is a brilliant book on economics for somebody with an engineering orientation in particular. So the model is quite simple. It starts by saying that the level of output is to some extent a function of the level of capital you have in your economy. And the relationship that economists use, most would know, is called the accelerator. It's the ratio between the level of capital as measured and the level of output as measured. Normally comes out to about 3 for most countries, somewhere between 2 and 4. So if you divide the capital stock by the accelerator, I'm using 3 here, you get the amount of output you're going to have. Given the amount of output, you can work out how many workers are going to be employed given labour productivity. So if I divide output by the productivity per worker, I get the number of workers who are going to be employed. And if you divide that by the population level, then you have the employment rate. And no matter how much economists fight over this whole issue, what's called the Phillips curve, after the great New Zealand economist Bill Phillips. They completely misinterpret Phillips, by the way. I know that your Reserve Bank governor is a great fan of Phillips' work. I've seen the Phillips machine here last time I was here last week. I'd like to get a demonstration from him of how the machine actually works. But Phillips was trying to bring engineering concepts into economics 40 years ago, 50 years ago, going on 60 years ago. And he was ignored by economists. They derided what he did as hydraulic Keynesianism. What he's actually trying to do is get analog computing into economics. And he built not just the hydraulic model you've got in this city, he also built an analog computer, meaning using valves and resistors and so on to model the economy, which of course was more flexible than the water-based one over there, which simply implements the multiplier accelerator model that I argue is a bad model to begin with, unfortunately. But the model that was popular at the time that Phillips put that machine together. But he also built an analog computer. So if Phillips had his way, we would have had dynamic modelling in economics 60 years ago. So it's rather nice to find that the first country that has an interest in bringing my modelling into practice within its treasury is New Zealand, and they've got the Phillips machine in the same street that I hope to be working to build those models. So I've got a certain amount of faith in New Zealand that I didn't expect to have, and I wouldn't have had it had Francis not organised his seminars, by the way, because the contact from the Treasury came through them knowing I was going to be here and seeing if I could squeeze them in. So I saw them last week, which was great. Long diversion, but I've now got to the Phillips curve. Having gone through the level of employment, the argument goes that there is some relationship between the rate of change of wages and the level of employment. And I'm emphasising here, I am using a linear argument. Now, Phillips argued strongly for a non-linear argument, a function. And he had 3 variables in his system, not just the rate of employment, there was also the rate of change of employment and the rate of change of prices, all of which is left out in conventional thinking about Phillips. As usual, they produce a cardboard cutout version of what matters rather than taking the thought seriously. I'm going on at length here because I'm using a linear relationship. And the point is the cycles I'm going to show you do not come out of assuming cyclical behaviour. Okay? Feeding in a linear relationship here gives you cyclical outcomes, the nature of a complex system. Because once I've got the level, the rate of change of wages, if I integrate that, I've got the wage level. Now, to work out what the wage bill is, I've got to multiply wages by the number of workers. I'm therefore multiplying one variable in the system by another. So I've got W, which is the wage rate, times L, which is the number of workers. And that's a nonlinearity. And it's not something imposed by assuming nonlinear behaviour. It's a structural nonlinearity. You can't have an economy that doesn't have workers being paid wages, yet anyway. So it's inherent to the system that relationship exists. And it's that inherent nonlinearity that gives you the cycles I'm about to show you. So if you subtract the wage bill from output, you get the level of profits. In the simple model that Goodwin put together, he assumed that capitalists invest all their profits. So profit is investment. Investment's the rate of change of capital stock. If I integrate that, I then close the loop. I get back from starting from the level of capital to getting the rate of change of capital. Integrated, I've got the new level of capital. So you put that together and simulate it, you get a cyclical system. And just to illustrate that again, in the software package Minsky that I'm getting written using a grant from the INET Foundation. I'll need to go across and find that. I thought I had it would come up from the menu system, but it's not doing that. Let's just go and see if I can spot it quickly here. This software is freely available, by the way. It's still beta stage. Lots of things go wrong with it. It doesn't have alt commands for file saving and stuff like that. You've got to save as first off rather than save, various little hassles like that, but it does work. So if you want to download it and have a play with it, just go to my website or go to, just search for the word Minsky on the web and you'll find it. Now here we go, look like I haven't, oh there we are, that's it, that's what I'm after. So that's the model I've talked you through a moment ago. So I've got level of capital stock, divide by the accelerator you get output, divide by labour productivity you get employment, divide by population you get the employment rate. I feed into a linear Phillips curve argument here. That gives you the wage, integrate it, multiply it by the level of labour, you get the wage bill, subtract that from output, you get profit, presume all the profits invested, you get an economy that's cyclical coming out of that. Okay, very simple piece of software. I could explain this to students in a first year lecture in the second week in about 10 minutes, I reckon, and get them thinking cyclically about the economy rather than thinking about it being in equilibrium, which is where we need to start from. So that's the basic vision that Goodwin had. But of course, he assumed that capitalists invest all their profits. Of course, that's a false assumption. They invest more than their profits during a boom and less than their profits during a slump. So bringing in more realism improves the model. That's what I did. I'm not trying to maintain some absurd fiction about equilibrium at all times. And if you try to do that, which neoclassicals do, then every time they go for a high level of realism, they've got to whack in more and more absurd assumptions to make the equilibrium hold together. And the clear one, of course, is the thing called rational expectations. You've heard that one, I imagine? Okay. I could play a word game. What would you describe as, how would you describe somebody who can accurately predict the future? Pardon? Yeah, no, who thinks they can accurately predict the future? No, actually can. You'd say a prophet, wouldn't you? Well, that's the definition of a rational person according to neoclassical economic theory. Okay, so what they call rational, a sensible person would call prophetic. Now, why do they do that? Because unless you accurately expect the future, your behaviour now will not be consistent with equilibrium. So to hang on to equilibrium, rational expectations was necessary. Otherwise, if you find your expectations are wrong about the future, then the way you behave now will not be fulfilled by how data work out, and you'll be forced to change your behaviour, meaning you're not in equilibrium. So to lock in the equilibrium assumption, they had to assume that people can prophesize the future accurately. And they call it rational. Now we fall for it because we know what the English word means. It's not what the economic word means. And that applies throughout economic theory, unfortunately. So I bring in the realistic assumption here that capitalists don't know the future, and they invest on the basis of the projecting current situations beforehand. So for an arbitrary but useful way to start modelling, I say let's assume that at an investment level of a profit rate of 3%, they invest all their profits. At a higher level than that, they invest more than their profits. At a lower level, they invest less. And of course, there's a slope at that same point as well. I could use a linear function there. It just makes more sense, constrains it to a realistic bound to have a non-linear function. and I feed that into the system. And what I then have is investment increasing debt. Where do they get the extra money from? They borrow it from the bank. This is where the endogenous money component comes in. So debt will rise if investment exceeds profit. And of course, they've also got to pay interest on their debt now as part of their net profit calculations. So interest is now, profit is now net of interest payments on existing debt. So I feed that into the model, and I get a whole model that looks like this. This is using a previous software package, an engineering package called VisSim. How many engineers in the room? A few. So you're all familiar with Simulink and VisSim, and what do you use? You use Simulink yourself at all in modeling? Okay. Anybody use systems engineering software? A bit. Okay. If you've flown in a Boeing 777, you've flown in a plane that was designed in software before it was built. And most modern machinery is designed in software like this prior to being implemented. And you then say, okay, make the physical machine meet the characteristics we've designed in the software, and it'll have the performance we expect. So this is designed by engineers over the last 40 years.
All modern engineering is dynamic.
Yeah, but using what, MATLAB or, yeah, other software. But this is a way to do it visually. So I initially used this package. Now I'm developing my own because this doesn't handle double entry bookkeeping. For the obvious reason, a physical flow goes from one point to another point. Whereas you're doing financial flows, you talk about matching assets and liabilities at all times, and you then have two things going in various places, and A, you get an absolute mess of ugly wires if you try to do it in one of these packages using all the wiring concepts they use, and B, you lose track of it. You can change the assets and forget to change the liabilities, and then the whole system is wrong, but you can't find the problem. So the software package I'm building is adding this double entry bookkeeping component I call the Godly table into one of these software packages. But once I put this into my own model, I get, in this particular simulation, I'm getting equilibrium. I'm getting the economy converging to equilibrium, and it involves, pardon me, I should meant to demonstrate that. It involves the capitalists accumulating a positive balance. So if I simulate this package now, I'll just see what speed I'm simulating it at. Let's see, I've got a bit of time to change this. I'll run it in real time at a factor of, say, 10 times real time. So each second is 10 years in this simulation. And what I get, the cycles and level of debt to output. If I head down here a bit, let's go inside the graphs. And I get the system slowly converging to equilibrium. Wages share converging to equilibrium, same for employment rate, and of course the debt level as well, which is the third variable you can't see, going to equilibrium over time. So the economy, if I just run that again, is stabilizing. Okay? So this is a classic nonlinear model. Close to the equilibrium it stabilizes, which is what you're watching right there. And including a debt to output level becoming negative, meaning firms are accumulating positive bank balances. This is a model only with implicit money in it. So Fisher's argument back in the Great Depression, before we had the knowledge of nonlinear systems at the stage we have now, was actually quite wise about this. He said that it's feasible to imagine that any economic variable will tend towards equilibrium over time. He said, but that stability can be very delicately poised. So close to equilibrium you'll converge, but if you're a slight distance away, instability ensues. And that is precisely what this model does. Because if I start exactly the same model, but I begin at a higher level of debt to GDP, then it looks like it's doing the same thing. I'll go to those graphs again of employment versus wages share, and I'll just check the simulation speed once more. Yeah, running a bit slowly makes sense here. So you see the same sort of cycle happening, a wider cycle as you can see, because you're starting further from equilibrium. And it looks like you're going to converge. But actually what happens is, when you go back and take a look at the debt level, this is what debt's doing. It's ratcheting up over time, a boom and a bust, like the same sort of cycle I described verbally to you that Minsky went through. You're seeing the same characteristics, and ultimately you get to a point where there's such a debt-induced boom that it's good night, Josephine. Last person out, please turn off the economy. Okay. And that's what we've been through, so what looks like stability becomes a crash. Now it's called the inverse tangent route to chaos. I found that after I first discovered the model. So you get an equilibrium existing in the model if it's close to initial conditions, but technically if you're further away, the equilibrium depends upon the initial conditions. And if you start further away from the equilibrium, there is no equilibrium. Okay? So there can be models in which there is no equilibrium. You can calculate what it can be, put the parameter values in, you find it doesn't exist. So that's the real world. That's what the sort of world we have. You can be locally stable near an equilibrium, which means actually a linear component of the model dominates the system. But you can be globally unstable. You get past a certain point and you get further and further away. And that's a bit like squaring numbers. If you square a number and it's less than 1, you're going to converge to 0. If you square that number to greater than 1, you'll diverge. It's that same sort of concept applying in a mathematical model. So that experience led me to making what I thought was a rhetorical flourish when I first wrote this paper, published in 95 but written in 93. And the flourish was to say that the vision this gave of the capitalist economy requires us to go beyond the habit of mind that Keynes described, the excessive reliance upon a stable past as the guide to the future. And so the chaotic dynamics should warn us against accepting a period of relative tranquility in a capitalist economy as anything other than a lull before the storm. Well, that's precisely what happened. And I then take a look at this is the simulation that I built, and I saw that sort of experience happening, a period of apparent stability in employment and wages share. Notice declining worker share of output as well, by the way, but apparent stability and suddenly breakdown at a later stage. And when you graph it in 3 dimensions, it looked like actually a volcano or like a tornado. Now, part of Minsky's argument as well was the government stabilizes by effectively giving firms a cash flow they wouldn't otherwise have during a downturn with which they can pay their debts. And then if they actually did progressive taxation, controlling speculation by taxing profits as levels rose as well. So I included that with the argument of a government sector whose spending depended upon the rate of employment. If unemployment rose, the government would spend more. If unemployment fell, it spent less. And of course, my model had a government that stuck the line at 5% of unemployment. So anything more than 5% unemployment, it would spend more. Anything less, it would spend less. Of course, what actual governments have done is back in the 1960s in Australia, if you had an unemployment rate greater than 2%, it was, every person manned the pumps. Chaos. Government's likely to lose the election. After 73, 5% was taken as the barrier, then 6%, then forget about it. So governments have drifted. They haven't held the line here. So what I'm describing when I put this model in is a government that actually is resolute, trying to make sure unemployment doesn't exceed a particular level, and 5% level I chose in the simulation. And profit, of course, is now net of wages, interest, and the government subsidy. So I put that all together into the system, and I get what you can call cyclical instability, but not breakdown. One of Minsky's main points was to say that stability in a capitalist economy doesn't mean equilibrium. What it means is cycles that don't get out of hand and don't lead to breakdown. So you saw breakdown in the previous model. What you get in this one is quite a remarkable thing when you first see it. This is now including the government sector inside here. And I'll bring up that same graph, the ratio of wages on one to output on one axis and the employment rate on the other. I'll just check my simulation plot. Let's go for run 10 times real time here. So I've got employment on the vertical axis and worker share of output on the other. And what you get looks like something that's going to hit stability. Then it looks like it's going to break down. And it goes back again. That's a fairly typical dynamic system in a sense. It's unstable, but its instability remains within bounds. And that's the sort of achievement that Minsky was aiming for. We want an economy, we don't want an economy without cycles, we just want one that doesn't have debt deflations, which of course is what we've got ourselves into by believing the economy can reach equilibrium or is always there. That's one thing, I'd love to print that with a 3D printer one day because it's actually a 4-dimensional object. So bringing in this realism is again making the model more realistic still, but what I'd left out in that model was Ponzi behaviour. Borrowing for unproductive reasons, not because you're going to be investing in new plant, but because you want to gamble on rising asset prices. So when I bring that into the system, I now can model the economy with, say, being in the stable range and having no debt and, of course, no Ponzi behaviour. And if I simulate that, again showing wages share against employment, I get a nice closed loop. The cycles going on there, you can't see them because it's not showing them processing around, but there's employment and wages share forever cycling in the same way. The system is quite stable. Pardon me, that's Goodwin's model. Now, if I then say, well, let's put debt in the model, but we start with being near the equilibrium, stable, and if I simulate that system again, it looks very similar. And it's now, as you can see, converging to equilibrium, like I showed you in the previous model. And the debt level, as with the previous model, is declining. Okay, getting negative debt, which means the firm sector's accumulated a positive bank balance. But now if I put in Ponzi behaviour, so here I have people borrowing money to gamble on rising asset prices, unproductive debt, just gambling or buying the shares rather than producing factories with the money. And what you get looks very similar when it starts. So you can believe your economy is doing pretty well if this is all you're looking at. And then suddenly, something changes. Starts to go off and rail in the way you had no idea it was going to do. And basically you're going down the gurgler of too much debt. You're heading towards zero employment, zero wages share, and infinite debt. And that's where we got ourselves stuck in with this crisis. When I take a look at what's happening at the debt level, what you've got is productive debt reducing, but the level of speculative debt rising over time. That's capturing what's actually happened. Now, I wish it hadn't, but I think that's what we've seen happen in the real economy. So it's showing that you've got a feasible outcome of a total breakdown. But this is still a model which I was not satisfied with because I've only got money in an implicit sense inside there. I have the change in debt enabling an increase in investment, which means, of course, I'm matching the change of debt. Therefore, you've got money, therefore you buy factory items with it. Or you have a change in debt, you therefore buy shares. So I'm implicitly taking money into account, but it's not explicitly there. I'm not modelling money creation. So what I wanted to do was bring in an actual monetary model. And what I worked out, courtesy of reading work by a French and Italian group of economists, they call themselves circuitists, with the main person being a guy called Augusto Graziani. By the way, Augusto is one of these great personalities you can meet in economics. Only stands about less than 5 foot tall. Perfect posture, and speaks in perfectly formed English paragraphs, not sentences. The whole paragraph comes out spontaneous, quite a character. And they insisted that the way you want to have to model capitalism is not as a barter system where you have two people, each with a different good, trying to swap it and get the other person's good. That's a barter economy. Two people, two goods, trying to work out a relative price. They said capitalism really is three people, a buyer, a seller, and a bank that records the transaction. So you bring in this triangular view, and then that gave me the insight to build effectively triangular models where the bank is recording what's happening financially. And using that set of inputs, that's actually a single entry table there, by the way. I've since improved the way I did this to use accounting double entry. But by feeding that into a simulation software package, I generate a set of equations out of them automatically. And the equations, when you do substitutions, are having behavioural elements inside there, you get the system of nonlinear differential equations that people who don't even know what they are can be producing using the Minsky software that I'm writing right now. That's the ambition. So I put that together with a price equation. Again, this is one of these strange things that happens when you work in a new area of economics. I had to work out a price equation to link the monetary flows with the real model I had. So linking the financial flow thing I've shown you now with the physical model of Goodwin. And I said, what am I going to use for a price equation? I said, oh, bloody hell, I've got to use supply equals bloody demand. Really annoyed me to do it. So I sat there because I'm working with monetary demand, of course, which is different. And I'm trying to work a dynamic equation out. But I thought, what about if I equate the monetary flow of demand with the monetary supply, which means I'm going to have cash coming out of the banking sector matched with price time quantity in the physical world. And I've got to work out a price equation. And when I did it, so it's using a neoclassical idea, supply equal demand, prices equilibrating the two. When I did it, I got this relationship here. In equilibrium, price is going to equal a markup representing 1 over 1 minus the worker's share of output multiplied by the monetary wage divided by labour productivity. That is actually a post-Keynesian pricing equation. So ironically, the neoclassicals and post-Keynesians fight like tooth and You know, cat and, well, they don't fight like cat and dog. We attack them, they ignore us. That's always been the way it's been. Now they're not ignoring me so successfully anymore. But I then put that in a dynamic guise. So the two equations are actually in equilibrium consistent. There's not a battle over the actual equation, funnily enough. What there is a battle is over including dynamics. So I made this a time convergence argument, and I brought in all the elements that Bill Phillips had in his Phillips curve. He talked about workers reacting in terms of the wage change, not just the level of unemployment, but also its rate of change, and having a cost of living adjustment as well, which pretty much describes what wage contracts are like. Put that together, I got this complicated expression for the rate of change of wages, and putting it into the model, what it generated was a system with 14 differential equations in it. And I put that there not for you guys, but it's basically because economists can't say I don't do math. The common back that neoclassicals do against critics is say, you just can't handle the math. No, some of us can do better math than neoclassicals, and of course what's now happening is physicists are turning up doing what they call econophysics, and no economist in their right mind can accuse a physicist of not knowing the math. So they're getting, that's one of the great advantages we have over Keynes in doing this stuff, that you simply can't make the argument that the sophisticated thinking is done by the neoclassicals. No, the mathematical power is now in hand of the critics rather than the believers in neoclassical economics. Now that model, when I simulate it, generates what I wanted to be able to get precisely, because the previous model I showed you, I had a period of great moderation in employment and wages share of output, but I couldn't have the inflation rate in there. Now with this model I can bring in inflation, and that's an uncalibrated run of the model. Simply setting a set of initial conditions that gave me a beginning fluctuations in inflation and level of employment, and then what came out of it was a collapse. There's extreme levels of deflation being shown there. But that's just a made up set of numbers. I haven't tried to fit it to the data. This is something closer to the data. That's the American data on employment, inflation, and the debt to GDP ratio. Smoothed, just taking out the variations over time. So this is smooth fit to the data. And that's what I've just shown you, imposed over the top. Pardon me, I did the simulation beforehand I imposed. So I get the stylized facts of the crisis. What you get, if you take a look back at that data again, that's the actual data, smoothed. And that's what I got as a simulation. Now, what came out of it was a sudden collapse. And that's what we saw, of course, happening in 2007. So you can actually fit what happened in the crisis. Here we go. That's what I wanted to do before. That's now extending the data a bit longer. So what I can't capture at the moment is this process, because what's happened after hitting the crisis is deleveraging. So people deliberately reducing their debt levels, but also, of course, people going bankrupt, which means the debt level falls. And to me, bankruptcy is an essential part of a capitalist system surviving. Because we didn't have bankruptcy, you didn't write the debt off, then you continue accumulating the debt and having to service it, and we're caught in what you can actually call a black hole of debt. Because fundamentally what I'm modelling here is a process which is stable if you're close enough to equilibrium, stable if behaviour is stable enough, etc., etc. But if you get further away from equilibrium or have more volatile investment behaviour, you can pass through an event horizon where you get sucked towards infinite debt. And that's again what my colleagues in the Fields Institute are starting to model. So that's what I want. That's my simulation. That's the data. And unfortunately, I think I'm too close to the data. I don't like having that level of predictive ability. So to move out of modeling back to the empirical data and then start talking about solutions, one thing which is so frustrating, and not just for me, also for quite a few good neoclassicals like Krugman, is that you see the political debate always being about this level, public debt, with no awareness of what's happening in the private debt level that's actually driving the crisis. When you look at the data, it's the private debt, again, that clearly causes the crisis. If I get politicians to look at that alone, there could be a lot of progress. Because you only can compare what's happening now to the Great Depression, and you can only compare the previous boom we've been through to the Roaring 20s. That's what matters. So this is a band-aid down here. What happens with public debt is a reaction to the level of private debt, what's going on in that system. And if you obsess about getting public debt down, you'll actually amplify the downturn, which is what we're seeing, of course, in Europe, and certainly big potential for America as well. Now, the trouble is we've got into a crisis we should never have got caught in. It's an endemic part of capitalism that it tends to lead you here, but these days we have the wisdom and the intelligence to realise that it can happen in a complex system and work out ways to prevent it. But of course, with neoclassical economics dominating policy, we did the exact opposite by ignoring this dynamic. Now, what I'm saying is, having got in the problem, how long could we be stuck in it? Well, if you look back at the Great Depression, I think this is the relevant level of debt to look at, because this level, when the ratio hit about 240% of GDP, was largely due to deflation, because GDP was falling so rapidly and prices were falling by 10% per annum as well, that the ratio blew out, even though from 1930 on, the nominal level of debt was falling. And this is what I call Fisher's paradox. He said the more debtors pay, the more they owe. Because in the 1930s, it was actually the business sector that was mainly in debt. The business sector debt began at 125% of GDP, blew out to 175%. Households in the financial sector had about 25% each. So it was businessmen who found themselves likely to go bankrupt unless they could improve their cash flow. So their reaction was to cut their prices. Otherwise, they go bankrupt. This time round, businesses peaked at about 70% of GDP. It's the household sector that's in debt. So rather than the businesses having to cut their prices to try to bring in cash flow, they've got less cash flow coming in, still enough to service their debt, but they can't work out where the customers are. Well, the customers are back at home eating spam because they can't afford to go shopping with the debt service they've got to do. So I think, in fact, getting out of this crisis could take longer than the Great Depression. But if you look back here, the rate of deleveraging from the beginning of the 1930s to the bottom level of debt was about a 9% per annum decline. We're currently declining at about 7.9% per annum. So fairly similar rate. The thing is, it would take us 25 years to take America till 2025 to get back to the level that they had in 1970. And this cartoon says it all for the mood in America these days, which is very different to the mood in Australia and New Zealand. Can you read the graphic or not? Okay, have a look. One of my favourite cartoons, the non sequitur cartoon, the other's Doonesbury. And the bloke is the sort of anti-hero of the script, has a brother who looks mysteriously like Richard Nixon, and saying, how long is it going to last? Will it turn around in our lifetime? Well, let's not get all pie in the sky here. Well, it might sound extreme to say this could take 2 decades to turn around, but it would equally have sounded extreme if I said in 1990 that Japan will be mired in a debt deflation for 20 years, and it still is. Okay? It's how long these crises can last. So we shouldn't take it lightly. Now, of course, we look around the world and see who's suffering the most, and without doubt it's the European Union. And this was a crisis on top of the one we're having as well, because this Maastricht Treaty, which brought the euro into existence, presumed that you could have a single currency and only need an independent central bank. And you can look at it and say, well, clearly the sponsors must have thought that that's all you need. You don't need fiscal union. You don't need exchange rate policy. And that can only be true if the economy is a self-adjusting system. And the person I'm quoting here said that he's driven to the view that that was, in fact, what the people who drafted the Maastricht Treaty believed. And he said, with that view that all you can do is control the money supply with a very rigid central bank and balance the budget, then when a crisis comes and you can't devalue, there's nothing to do except suffering terminal decline, leading to immigration and as the only alternative, poverty or starvation. That was written by Wynne Godley in 1992. Now, Wynne Godley is, of course, a non-neoclassical economist, somebody who developed monetary economics. Now, I actually call the table that I use in my modelling system a Godley table in honour of Wynne's work. He died 2 years ago. But he could see this in 1992. And when you said that in 1992, imagine how extreme you would have been regarded as being. Look at Spain and Italy, Spain and Greece and Ireland right now. Immigration and poverty and starvation. It's literally what's happening there. And people often don't realise just how bad it is. You've got to see the data to relieve it. Now that's talking from the progressive end of economics, the end I want to promote. This is another guy whose name you'll recognise, saying, well, is it sensible to have a common currency in Europe? And he said it's actually one where it's not a sensible idea. The separate nations who've got far more loyalty to their own country than the idea of Europe. There's less freedom of movement of goods and capital and labour. The European Commission is only a tiny fraction of total spending, whereas of course in America, Washington dominates spending compared to the states. And it's the countries that matter rather than the bureaucrats in the centre. And you've got more rigidity, etc., etc. He said, in those situations, a flexible exchange rate is an extremely useful adjustment mechanism. Milton Friedman in 1997. So it was a abhorrent idea to bring that single currency in because it rules out an exchange rate, it rules out deficits if they're more than 3% of GDP, and it was just doomed to fail. And this is what it's doing now. This is looking at the level of unemployment across the EU and in the worst two countries, Greece and Spain. So the recorded rate in Spain is now 25%. Now that's not, including disguised unemployment. That's using the strict ILO definition, where if you say yes to the question if you're out of work, which I think should be the end of the definition, but yes to also, have you actively looked for work in the last 4 weeks? And yes to, are you ready to start working tomorrow? And no to, have you worked more than an hour in the last 2 weeks? Then you're unemployed. And you're between the ages of 15 and 64. Now in that definition, 1 in 4 Spanish fulfills the definition of unemployment, which of course means the actual level is worse than that, much worse. So one of the solutions I've proposed, and there's plenty of people trying to propose a solution to it, I think you have to recognise that the euro could never be anything more than a currency for international trade. All the reasons that both Godley gave and Friedman gave, it shouldn't have been used for domestic current transfers. So what you could do is reintroduce the old currencies, but call them euro, drachma, euro mark, etc., and float them on a 1-for-1 parity with the euro. And then denominate all debts in those sub-euros, and then let the market decide what they're worth. And of course you get a drastic drop in the value of the euro drachma, an increase in the value of the euro mark. You'd give the finance sector one hell of a shock, but they caused the problem to begin with, even though the politicians set it up by believing they're bureaucrats who thought the economy was self-equilibrating. But do that, and you'd hopefully get out of the problem. Now what about someone that doesn't believe it has a problem as much? Well, again, it's a question of not of quality but of scale. That's the New Zealand GDP. So you guys did have a dip in nominal terms when the crisis began. And here's opposing your change in debt over the top. So again, for a while, you did actually go through a deleveraging process. You certainly had a deceleration in debt. So qualitatively, the same sort of dynamics. Went on from that to take a look at the employment relationship. Here's change in debt in America and the employment rate. Again, the sort of thing that's not supposed to exist according to loanable funds. Clearly it does in America. And you can see how deep the change in debt was. It went from plus 30% of GDP pretty much to minus 20%. Your case? Plus 18 to about minus 4. And the same sort of basic dynamics for unemployment as well. You had less deleveraging, and you're getting a positive boost from debt right now. You can see that the red line there is above the 0 mark, so change in private debt is adding to aggregate demand. But it's trending down, so there's a possibility of unemployment coming along courtesy of that. Now if I take a look at the second order dynamics here, this is now looking at credit acceleration and change in unemployment. And I've set it up so you can see the correlations properly. You can see just how deep that deceleration of debt was, and of course the massive increase in unemployment as a result of it. This is the New Zealand situation. You have the same dynamics, just a lower scale, and notice also that acceleration is turning negative once more. It's the turning points that seem to be correlated with change in unemployment there. So I think you're heading, again, that's the second reason to say likely to expect a rise in unemployment in New Zealand shortly. But I've got some good news. First of all, you're in more mortgage debt even than Australia, which surprised me. Notice, by the way, that the rate of growth of the level of American mortgage debt grew more slowly than the debt in Australia, but reached a lower peak than we did. But you guys, beginning at a higher level of mortgage debt, actually borrowed more money from Australian banks than Australians have done. You've got a high level of mortgage debt here. That was quite a surprise to me to find that out. And then you look at acceleration of debt. Similarly, we've had a higher rate of acceleration than America. If I do this correlation back to 1990, I get a correlation of about 0.8 between acceleration in household debt and change in acceleration in mortgage debt and change in house prices in America. That's the American data, just more over the last 10 years. This is New Zealand. So you're even more driven by mortgage acceleration determining change in house prices than the Americans are. And you had a bit of a dip there, but notice at the moment, mortgage acceleration in this chart is the blue line. It's rising at the moment. So I expect you're going to see rising house prices. That's the good news. But I don't think it's sustainable in the medium term because you've already got a higher level of mortgage debt even than Australia has right now and than America achieved in its bubble. So just like a car can, the hardest point for a car to accelerate at is its maximum speed. I think a similar thing applies here. You're going so fast in the level of debt, you've got so high, there just isn't much headroom to increase the debt. So it's likely that that acceleration will turn negative in the longer term, like over about a year, and you'll see falling house prices. But for the medium term, I'd certainly expect rising house prices. Now, of course, Australia, same sort of story, my own country. Here's the long-term view for Australia. I've shown you before. Not as bad as America, but a higher level than we've ever had before. That's putting the American data on top of the Australian data. So again, the reason the antipodes are different is not because we didn't have the crisis down here. We had it at a lower scale with a lower level of debt. But we're likely to have a bigger one in terms of what's going to happen with house prices ultimately. And this is looking now what happened, how much deleveraging have we done. I've graphed it so that the change is exactly the same on either side of the chart, but I'm starting over here with 310% of GDP as the debt level for the Americans and 200% for Australia and New Zealand. And you can see how much debt has plunged in America and how little it's gone down over here. So again, part of why we're seeing a different phenomenon here is a lower rate of the same process, but it's still fundamentally the same process. Now, again, looking at what we did in terms of debt finance aggregate demand. Again, I showed you how America went massively negative, whereas Australia got to a certain point, we didn't even have the negative period you guys had in terms of change of debt subtracting from demand. We bounced, and we bounced because of what I call the first-home vendors boost, because Australians were encouraged back into the mortgage market by doubling the grant they gave to first-home buyers, which of course meant they took it to banks, levered up by a factor of 5 or 10, and then sold it to people who then did the same thing with the money they got from the first-home buyer, and you actually had about a $100 billion turnaround in the change in mortgage debt, courtesy of that policy, even though the government amount was smaller. Then when I factor in government spending, you get the same idea. We didn't, again, the government spending and the RUD stimulus again meant we never went into the variance of negative debt, negative change in debt. And with Australian housing, a more volatile story than the New Zealand situation. But again, we're facing accelerating debt. Here is the red line, and a turn up in house prices as well. So again, even though the house prices, I mean, I'm sick of the property lobby in Australia, as you can imagine. I want to see house prices fall. I've had them up to here, you know. But looking at my own analysis, my data predicted there'd be an increase in house prices in the most recent, and it's happened. But again, the same sort of story for New Zealand. I just don't think it's sustainable for any length of time. With the amount of debt we're in now, which is 5 times the amount of mortgage debt that happened back in 1990, we just can't sustain permanent acceleration in mortgage debt without getting to impossible levels and people falling over and not being able to become first-home buyers anymore, and the bubble will run out. So again, the same dynamics apply when I look at the change, the acceleration in debt and the change in employment. Except we had we got out of this so quickly because we went from a deceleration to acceleration again so rapidly, but not as high as the Americans, interestingly enough. So that's the world we're in. How do we get out of it? Well, the conventional way that's been tried by Ben Bernanke is what they call quantitative easing. You remember the old Mobile cartoon, Oils Ain't Oils? You didn't have that one, okay. I'd say quants ain't quants, because quantitative implies changing the quantity of money. But in fact, it's not directed at that at all. It's not injecting money into the economy. It's getting money into the reserve accounts of banks by buying bonds off them. It's just expanding the range of bonds that the Reserve Bank will buy. So normally the Reserve Bank will only buy short-term government bonds. And by buying the bonds, it injects money into the reserve accounts of the banks, and therefore has some control over the short-term interest rate by doing that, because they set the floor. But what they're doing here is buying long-term government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, some commercial bonds, student loan bonds, and so on. And they're trying to flatten the yield curve over the whole range to reduce long-term rates in the belief that cutting interest rates will boost the economy. So boosting reserves, which can't boost lending, as I explained earlier. And of course, do we want more lending? You know, it's amazing people don't even think through the logic. If you believed it worked, do you think the country needs more debt, more private debt? You know, because Europe, the SDR idea, try to get us out of that. There's many popular solutions that are proposed. We have some people here from Positive Money, for example, which is one of the many groups trying to work out an alternative monetary system. The American Monetary Institute want to have state creation of money and private distribution of that money. And there are temporary measures like local currencies, which I actually think are a good idea. They're not a permanent solution because they're not going to finance the next semiconductor factory, but they are going to maintain circulation when the credit money system has collapsed. So those are good ideas. The idea that I'm proposing is what I call a modern Jubilee, or putting it more in the current vernacular, quantitative easing for the public. And that would be, rather than injecting the money into the reserve accounts of banks, the central bank puts that money into the personal accounts of households. Now, it's got the right to do that, intriguingly enough. This is the Federal Reserve Act. The act they're actually doing a lot of the quantitative easing under enables them to inject money directly into private accounts. Section 13 of the act, I think it is. So I would do that, but I'd have the proviso that if you are in debt, you have to reduce your debt. So, you know, a pro rata per capita injection of money. But if you're in debt, you must pay your debt down. Now, if you're not in debt, you get cash injection from the central bank. Now, what that would mean for the banks is they would then have, because the condition is the debt has to be paid down, then the value of their loans would drop. And of course, the value of any securitized loans would also drop. That would not hit the banks at the solvency level, but it would cut back their liquidity. They have less income earning assets. And that's a good idea because the banking sector is too big. It needs to be reduced in size. Owners of securitized bonds would suffer as well, with a reduced value of bonds and reduced income flow from it, but it'd be much more realistic income flow. It'd be an income flow that the debtors could actually sustain. And they'd be compensated by having got an injection beforehand anyway. So they could spend out of the injection of cash. You wouldn't be benefiting debtors over savers in this idea. So you're trying to restore aggregate demand while not causing moral hazard out of the process. And you're trying to reduce financial sector income, which I think is a vital thing to do. So that's the idea that I'm putting forward. And it's not going to be painless. In fact, it would expose a fair bit of pain in the economy because this financialization of the system has masked the transfer of productive capacity out of Western countries like yours into imports. So you'd actually be exposing how much you've deindustrialized your economy and reduced its productive capacity during the last 20 or 30 years. And there'd be a worry about doing it for some countries because by curing one problem, you'd expose another, and guess what? The person who cured it would be blamed for causing the problem. I use the analogy of being a bit like a doctor who's got a patient who's gone mountaineering without enough warm clothing and is suffering gangrene in both feet and is unconscious. And if you chop the feet off straight away before the person wakes up, you mean they only lose their feet. They wake up and sue you for making them into a cripple. So you've got to wait till they become conscious and they've lost half a leg, and then they'll thank you forever for saving their lives. It's that sort of dilemma. So I'm not so sure I want this thing to be working, certainly for Australia or New Zealand, before we actually realise we're caught in a problem. At the moment, we don't believe it. But you also have to stop a speculative surge occurring as well, because if you actually gave that cash injection and let people get back into borrowing money to gamble on house prices, it'd all start all over again. So I want to find ways of stopping the banking sector lending money to finance gambling on asset prices. And one of the concepts I have, I think, is fairly watertight. It's what I call the PIL, property income limited leverage. And the idea there is to limit the amount that can be secured against a property, not on the income of the borrowers, but on the income of the asset being purchased. Because at the moment, the banks have this mythology that they lend on the basis of the income of the borrower. Well, back in the 1960s, they give you a 70% loan to valuation ratio and make sure it didn't cost more than a certain proportion of your house, your income. It was, you know, a one income family could do it back then. Now, of course, they give you a 97% loan to valuation ratio. Well, back in the 60s, if you had $30,000 saved, the bank would give you $70,000 to go and buy a house with. That's a 70% LVR. Now you're walking with $30,000. They give you $970,000. And people wonder why house prices have risen. That's fundamentally what's gone on. So the trouble is, at the moment, if we had two people competing over buying, you two are competing for buying a house, you both had the same income, the one with the higher leverage would win. So there's actually an encouragement right now for us to want higher leverage. But if it was limited to the income of the property, and the property you wanted to buy was earning $25,000 a year in rent, both of you could only get $250,000 from the bank. So to beat the other person in bidding for the house, you'd need to save more money. You get a negative relationship and a negative feedback loop between house prices and debt rather than the positive one we have now. So that's what I'm trying to do all the way through. So get rid of positive feedback loops. And we clearly have one between asset prices and debt levels, and remove the incentive we have for wanting debt, because debt isn't a good thing. This is the bizarre thing banks have done that persuaded us that debt is good by saying, well, you've got to take out this charge and you owe us money for 30 years, but if the property you buy doubles in price, you pay for it with cash, you just double your money. But if you lever it by 90%, all it has to do is rise by 10%, and you've doubled your money. So leverage is a good thing. Now, of course, the leverage itself causes the house price rise. That's what sucked us in the first place. So I use the analogy, it's a bit like going to a dentist with a sore tooth. And you only get the sore tooth pulled out, but somehow the dentist persuades you look sexier with less teeth. We've got to stop the banks being able to do that about debt. And one way to do it is to remove that link that gives you the asset price appreciation in the first place. Now in shares, I've put forward an idea I call Jubilee shares. This gets knocked up by people, and I'm willing to knock it. The idea is to say that at the moment, most of the money that goes into shares comes from borrowed money, leverage and so on, and is spent on buying existing shares, not new ones. The secondary market dominates. What I want is to have a system that means that it's far more attractive to invest in the primary market and actually give money to firms than it is to gamble on buying and selling shares of existing speculators. So the idea of a Jubilee share was to let a share be sold 7 times, and then after the 7th sale, it expires after 50 years. So it goes from being something which you actually can gamble and say the price is going to go from $1 a share, as you had with Yahoo, to $1,000 a share over a matter of a couple of years. In fact, it gets to 400 and crashes back down again. You simply couldn't say that if you knew that after the 7th sale, it was ultimately going to expire. So I try to get realistic valuations coming out of it, and you'd only borrow money if you're going to use that money to buy a share off the company in the first instance. It only makes sense at that level. Now that might not necessarily work. We've got to find something that stops the gearage, and certainly I'd be in favour of abolishing margin lending. I showed you that chart earlier of the relationship between acceleration of margin debt and change in the stock market in Australia. That surprised me. 0.8. Again, it's going to be a positive feedback. One will cause the other to some extent, but to get that level of correlation, it's just screaming that it's what we're actually getting out of rising asset prices is accelerating debt. It's not making anybody better off in the long run. So those are my ideas, and let's have a bit of a conversation. Thank you.